So yeah, growing up in the CNS church, the hymns.
Yes.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, that's like a staple in that church. So
Yeah.
Tell us about how you were, first of all, introduced to that. And I know there's a history behind that because the hymns didn't necessarily originate in the CNS church.
Yeah, some of them, yeah.
So yeah, let's
the hymns were my first introduction to Yoruba. Because
so people know Yoruba is the language.
Yeah, Yoruba from West Africa, Nigeria. One of the many languages spoken in Nigeria, of the tribe of which I am from. So yeah, I remember the hymn book was like my first introduction to like written and sung Yoruba. And I remember as a musician going to choir practice, and in our church, especially in the days before, screens in church and on projection, all that kind of stuff, we actually would call out the hymns. So you're singing it live, and to know the next line, one mommy or one daddy is calling it out. Shout out to Mama Abisiriu. That's like my second mom, and she would always, growing up, her voice is perpetually etched in my mind because she was always the one calling out the hymns as we're singing. So as she's saying it, I'm hearing the right tone of Yoruba because it's a tonal language. And then I'm hearing it sung, right? And then what I would do is I would go home and I would get the English hymn book. I had a green second edition CNS hymn book, and then we also back in the day had a green English edition.
These are like originals.
These are like the old originals. And so I would look at the hymn, and then I would look at the English translation. Or even in church, someone would preach, because for the younger generation, someone would preach in Yoruba, they would translate to English or vice versa. So my first introduction was just mommy calling out the hymns, me hearing them sung. And I just remember that at certain points in the services, things would shift based on the hymns we were singing. Things would shift. Like, maybe it's a processional hymns. I would call us a Pentecostal liturgical church. There's things that we do that are very like Catholic, like the Apostles' Creed, kneeling down, processional, recessional things, Vespers. And then there's, Pentecostal stuff, right? Pentecostal. What we do in Kiribu,
Yeah.
Shout out to Kiribu, yeah, my people. So it was one of those things where those worlds merged, and the hymns basically aided each part of the service. So in the beginning of the service, it's a processional hymn. There's an intro, very repentant. There's an opening hymn, kind of a longing, a drawing closer to God. Then there's a thanksgiving, a celebratory hymn. Then you go into a 12 o'clock prayer hymn. After 12 o'clock prayer, then there's a time, a hymn before the sermon. You move on from hymn before the sermon. Then you go on to the closing and collection. Closing collection leads you now to the Vesper. Vesper now leads you now to the recessional, so everything, all of the hymns were basically telling you where in the service you were. And the hymns, traditionally, they're supposed to speak to that part of the service, right? So if it's a 12 o'clock prayer hymn, the lyrics, the words of that hymn are going to be prayerful, right? Or ways that you can, lift your eyes to God. The Thanksgiving hymn is going to be definitely celebratory, maybe something you can dance to, you can celebrate to. So the hymns instructed me in Yoruba because I got to hear the language being spoken. I got to hear it in context. We're talking about this, so there's a hymn about this in the Yoruba language.
So as far as like the lyrics, from what I understand, I remember taking a look at the hymn book for the first time, and actually several times after the first time. It wasn't until like the 15th, 100th time that I opened the hymn book and I realized that there were Bible scriptures.
Yeah. Yep.
So when you discovered that, how was that? What was that moment like for you?
The funny thing is, so God gave me this phrase when I did the first Orin Adura, and it was, hymns are sound doctrine and sound theology placed to anointed melodies that have stood the test of time. And what I realized is that I would come across things in the Bible that I thought were actually hymn lyrics, but they're actually the Bible, Wow. And at the top of, like you said, at the top of each of the hymns, there's a biblical reference. There's a verse saying this hymn is coming out of this verse. Kind of gives you the context of what the hymn is saying or doing or trying to proclaim. So, So Orin Adura was like, the hymn book was like my introduction to the Bible, but I didn't know it. That it was like teaching me the Word of God. I didn't know it. Yeah, sound doctrine, sound theology, placed to anointed melodies that have stood the test of time.
Everything just kind of like lined up.
Yeah, lined up, right?
So
Because I mean, the 7-year-old and the 70-year-old can sing hymns.
That's amazing.
You know,
That's
like, right, but you know, if you look at the rest of their discography, right, those two worlds don't mix, right? The young person listens to this, old person listens to this, but hymns are like this thing that have transcended time. You know, their melodies have transcended time, the lyrics have transcended time. People don't even write hymns. They don't write. There's no lyricism like hymns anymore, or if there is, it's a very small percentage. So.
And so that's why for you, if I'm not mistaken, as a musician, it's very important to let the hymns breathe.
Yes.
You know, when there's administration going on in church.
Yes.
Thanksgiving hymn.
Right.
12 o'clock hymn, processional hymn.
Yeah.
Even the closing hymn.
Yes.
Vesper,
closing hymn. Yeah.
Different things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Intimate moments with God that the congregation as a unit is in.
Yeah.
I know it's very important for you, for other musicians to understand, like, this is a moment for us to meditate.
Yes.
And pray.
Yes.
So how is it that how are you able to handle your assignment as a minstrel?
Yeah.
And your relationship with God in that sync? How are you able to balance that? Are they in sync, or?
That's a great question. I would say that I'll answer that in two. It's like a two-sided coin. Mm-hmm. Number one, I think I didn't realize this until I got to college, where I really feel like God like met me in a very special way. I think for a long time I tied my musicianship to who I was as a person, and I think God wanted to separate that, actually.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was like my whole life was like, oh, Tolu drums. Mm. Tolu plays the drums. Yeah. I Tolu don't Tedru. You know, it's like music and Tolu were synonymous. Mm. But when I got to college, I feel like God gave me the revelation of that. You're a worshiper who is mine, and you happen to play music. Wow. You know, you happen to have this talent that I've given you. Yeah. But if I ever never played music again, I would still, my sonship would still be intact with God, and I would still be a worshiper, with or without instruments, right?
So they take the instrument from the worship.
The heart of worship is still there, yeah. So David was a musician, King David was a musician, but he wasn't called the musician after God's own heart. He was called the man after God's own heart, right? So he said, like, yo, you're my son first. You're after my heart. You happen to play the harp. You know, you happen to lead worship. You happen to do that. So that was just a revelation for me. So, and then the other side of that is, because of that, I can now come into worship with the right perspective, that the music is there to serve so people can worship. Beautiful. Not so they can see the musician, Tolu, so they can see the God. Right? The God, yeah, right? Yeah. God, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, but if my identity is as a musician, that means I want people to see my musicianship, right? Mm. So the reason why people don't like this always about Orin Adura, because I slow down the hymns. I don't put a lot. There's not like Alujo. There's not tons of danceable music. Although, check this new album, it's gonna be crazy. But the reason why I do that is very purposeful. It's on purpose. Is that I want to shave the things that can be a distraction down, right? And if we can shave those things down, we can hear the lyrics of the hymns, and the lyrics of the hymns will instruct us how to worship God and enable us to worship God in a way that sometimes we're not always able to do because of the noise. The term in communication is competing stimuli. It's too many things going on, so you don't hear the main message. So if I strip it down, if I can create instrumentation in a service or on a CD that supports the upliftment of God and our eyes to look up as opposed to look parallel, then I've accomplished what I'm supposed to accomplish. Yeah.
So how is it, you've been in this for your entire life.
Yeah.
And I know you have a lot of young people that look up to you in the church and even outside of the church. You're impacted
by His grace. By His grace, yeah.
It's been amazing. How are you able to communicate what you just said? Because that's heavy.
Yeah.
That responsibility is heavy. How are you able to communicate what you just said to someone who's looking up to you?
Man, I really hope that my life example will speak louder than my words. That's the most important thing to me is, wow, I want people to say, oh, like, yeah, brother Tolu, he carries himself different than I see the normal person carry. That's my prayer, is that I wouldn't necessarily have to be like, hey, what you should, talk to people in a certain way where they get it. Hopefully they see like something's different, and then they will actually, they'll come and see the hope that lies within. They'll come and inquire about the hope that lies within. So that's my desire, is that people would see a different lifestyle. They would hear different music that lifts up Jesus, and then they would inquire about it. And then once people inquire, there's an open door to share, and where people can receive with the conviction of the Holy Spirit.